Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to show you the Queen's Gambit declined repertoire for black, one of the richest openings in chess and the d4 equivalent of e4, e5, classical approach to a defense to d4. And one could argue that this is the best approach if you want to get a good solid position without too much risk. Now, that being said, the Queen's Gambit declined isn't a risk-free opening, and it's not always safe, it's not always slow. So it's the opening you can see on the screen. White starts with d4, black plays d5, and after c4 the Queen's Gambit, black plays e6. The entire Queen's Gambit declined repertoire for black is available on Nocti, and among probably more than 50 other repertoires I've created, you can now find the QGD for black. The reason I do this is because it's way better to practice an opening against a sparring partner than to learn theory. Now, if you have a human who's willing to play with you, that's great. In the absence of one, you can play against Nocti. Nocti is a human-like AI that's going to challenge you with the repertoire you import. So let's say play. I want to play as black. You can select the difficulty here. So let's play d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, bishop e7. Okay, Nocti is playing the main line. Nocti is going to be giving you feedback, and it's going to mix things up. The best thing is, it's not going to play perfectly even when it's winning. It's not going to play very poorly like an engine giving away pieces when it's losing. So the best way to learn an opening is to practice it. If you want to check out Nocti, there's a ton you can do for free. But if you do decide to go premium, use the code Hanging Pawns to get a massive 64% discount. The entire repertoire is also available for download on my Patreon page. You can purchase it separately for $3 US, as well as, a million other repertoires: Caracan, Sicilian, King's Indian, Vienna, King's Gambit, E4, D4, the English, the London, Sicilian, pretty much anything. You can buy them separately, but you can also become a member for $4 US a month and gain access to all of them, as well as 500 other posts. Now, before we get into anything else, let's begin with some move order tricks white could try. First of all, if white plays the English with c4, I would recommend that you play e6. And that way, if white ever plays d4, you can play d5, transposing into the Queen's Gambit declined. Of course, if they play it straight away, then you play d5. If they play knight c3, I would recommend knight f6. And now, once again, if d4, you play d5. If knight f3, you still play d5. And once again, you have something very similar to what you want to do. The best move for white here, of course, is d4. If white starts with knight f3, I would recommend that you go d5. Once again, if they ever go d4, then you just go e6 and you have your opening. But you still have knight f6 as a flexible move, staying true to your structure. So knight f3 and c4 don't guarantee that you're going to get the Queen's Gambit declined, but it's a very good attempt at entering the position So, as you may know, I play the Semi-Slav and the Caracan as black, or I have been playing them for a long time. And I always tried to enter the same position against anything white plays. And you can do the same thing with the Queen's Gambit declined repertoire. Now, one other move order after d4, d5, if white knight, excuse me, now plays knight f3, I would recommend that you play the move knight f6. And if they go c4, then you go e6, Queen's Gambit declined all over again. We basically just want to get this structure. So there are some move order tricks. Of course, it's not possible to play the Queen's Gambit declined against e4 or b3 or whatever else. Now, before we get into the theory, I'm going to show you three structures that are important. This is the first structure, and this pawn is usually on c7, but our aim is to play the move c5. Let's have a look at black's first two moves. Black plays e6 and d5. That means that the bishop on c8 is a problem piece. And what we are going to do in what's called the Tartakower variation, also known, or Tartakower defense, excuse me, also known as the main line, is we're going to play the move b6. Now imagine the c5 pawn still on c7, we play b6 and bishop b7, and then ideally we play the move c5. And of course, depending on what white does, we could have several different things happen. One very important thing is that as soon as we play the move b6, white still has a pawn on c4, they can choose to take on d5. Now, they understand why we are playing b6. We want to play bishop b7. So when they take on d5, we still have a bishop on c8. We don't really want to play e d5, because then even if when our bishop reaches b7, it's going to be blocked. And of course, by playing e d5, we have opened up this diagonal for the bishop. However, b6 will have been, you could argue, a wasted move. So that's one important structure. This is, let's call it the mainline structure. Now, the second most important structure in the Queen's Gambit declined is the Carlsbad, and this is what we get from the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. I'm going to go into all the theory and all the stuff a bit later, so don't worry about that. But this is the second most important structure. For some reason, I keep getting disconnected because I'm on my mobile connection. So in the Carlsbad structure, white has this 2-to-1 pawn minority on the queen side, and white's most successful plan in high-level play, on any level of play really, is to try to play b5. And that's what's known as a minority attack. I've recorded a full video on the strategy of the minority attack, so you can go and watch that. I'm not going to waste time on that here, but I'm just going to show you that this is what white's trying to achieve. White's trying to create a backward c-pawn, and then imagine white has a knight on c3, they play knight a4, knight c5, you're going to be worse for the rest of the game. So our goal in the Carlsbad will be to prevent an easy b5 from happening, and I should say that's not always possible. In some cases, in fact, in the main line, white will succeed in playing b5 and taking on c6, but we will have gotten enough compensation in the form of the bishop pair and some control over the e4 square and the e file. Now, in the Queen's Gambit declined, especially in the exchange variation, the c1 bishop is usually on g5, and our bishop is on e7. So in order to accelerate b4, white can often take on f6, take the knight on f6, dragging our bishop away from b4 and then play b4. So bear that in mind. Those are the three structures I wanted to have a look at. Now let's get into the Queen's Gambit declined. First of all, I should say that there are three possible moves here. Well, four, I mean, white can always take and go into the exchange. We will cover that. But the two most common are knight c3 and knight f3. And depending on which defenses white fears the most, white's going to choose one of those two moves. Now, black could play Ragozin, the Vienna, many different defenses within the Queen's Gambit declined. We're going to stick to the Tartakower, a very classical approach. So as far as we're concerned, we don't really care which move white plays. They, just make a move, we do the same thing. Whichever move they make, we go knight f6, and then we go bishop e7, and then we castle. This is usually what happens. This is, you could call it the main line. Now we can castle or play h6. I prefer playing h6 straight away to see whether white commits to taking on f6. That's possible. We're going to cover that. But let's say a bishop h4, which is slightly more common, e3 and b6. And this is the structure I was talking about. This is our main line structure. Now our goal is to go bishop b7 and c5. Of course, the same thing could be achieved if white starts with knight f3. However, there's a difference. If white starts with knight f3 and we go knight f6, white now has the option to play g3, which they could have done on the previous move as well. And the reason white plays knight f3 instead of g3 on move 3 is to avoid some variations of the Catalan which they may dislike. That being said, g3 is a perfectly playable move. If they play g3, we're going to go into the open Catalan, and we will cover that straight away at the beginning of this, because it's unlike the rest of the variations we're going to be looking at. So when they play G3, we're playing the open Catalan. Excuse me. And the rest I'm going to show you as we go along. So the three most common types of structures, types of openings we're going to be playing are the open Catalan, the exchange, which is this, the Carlsbad, okay, this, and the Tartakower, this position. Those are the three key positions. Now, there are going to be some variations, there are going to be differences, for example, the Horwitz attack, and there are differences, but that's the main body of our repertoire. Now, let's start with the Catalan. So d4, d5, c4, e6. And in fact, Milan and I are preparing for a tournament as we speak, and we have played a game in the open Catalan. I had the white pieces from this position, and castles, dc4. This is the open Catalan. Now, white has several moves. White can play knight e5, knight a3, queen a4, or queen c2. Queen c2 is the most common move, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. If they play knight e5, now once again, all of this is in the repertoire, so don't just follow along with the repertoire if you want to study the exact move orders. I'm going to focus on plans here. White most likely will want to recapture this pawn, which is why they play queen c2. If they play knight e5, the idea is similar. They want to recapture the pawn, and more importantly, they're preventing b5. So white must do something in order to prevent black from simply keeping the pawn. On knight e5, we're going to play knight c6, and we're never afraid of knight c6, bc6, bishop c6, because now we can go to b8, and on knight c3 we go bishop b7. This is perfectly fine, which is why on bc6 most people don't bother taking the pawn on c6. They play knight a3. We take that, and we play bishop a6, and this is, in my opinion, very, very playable for black. Now, if queen a4 is played straight away, we're going to do the same thing we do against queen c2. However, this time we are going to succeed in playing b5. Our move is a6. Now, if the queen does not take, then we play b5. So queen c4, b5, queen c2, bishop b7. This is not a popular variation for a reason. We have successfully challenged the diagonal, and we can just play c5. We can play knight bd7 and c5. Knight a3 is uncommon, and I remember looking at this when I was going through Avruk's books on the Catalan. He just recommends taking on a3, and I mean, there's a lot of subtlety here, but in practice, these pawns are awful, in my opinion. And if you look at master games, and black's plan is now bishop d7 simply, knight e5, and bishop c6, and that's it. If they take on c4 now, then they lose the game straight away. Knight c4, bishop g2, king g2, queen d5 check, fork on the knight and the king. That's game over. So they basically have to take on c6, knight c6, and something like bishop b2. We have kept our pawn for a while. We aren't really going to keep it forever, but from here we can play knight d5 and hope to play c3 and so on. But all of these are sidelines. The main move for white is queen c2. And when they play queen c2, black always plays a6. Well, not always, but we're going to play a6. That's the best move. If queen c4, we play b5, and we have transposed the line with queen a4. So, so white plays a4. Now, when white plays a4, something very interesting has happened. White has just given away the b4 square, and our plan will be to secure the b4 square with a5 and knight a6 and jump into b4. So by the time white has recaptured this pawn and done something, developed the knight and the bishop, say to f4 and c3, We have a knight on b4, we have excellent control over d5, and have a great position. It's equal according to the engine, it's nothing special, but once a4 is played, and it should be played, our plan is to eventually go a5. First of all, bishop d7 we develop. They take the pawn, we play bishop c6. And now white has two moves. White can play bishop f4, or white can play bishop g5. Bishop f4 is, in my opinion, a bit more interesting, although slightly less common. Now the main move for black here is bishop d6, which is fine. There's also a5 straight away, there's also knight bd7, but we are going to stick to bishop d6. And believe it or not, white can allow bishop f4. There's a game Karpov lost against Ribli? I don't remember. I think it was Zoltan Ribli. In any case, queen c1 is the main move. But white can also play bishop g5, which you could argue is a loss of tempo, and white can also play knight c3, completely ignoring bishop f4. If they do that, we're going to take on f4, gf4, and a5. And after e3, our plan is simple. Knight a6, knight b4. Very simple. When white plays knight e5, which is white's strongest square, we're going to exchange on g2, play c6, and have this very solid kingside position where white's going to struggle to break through. If they play queen c1 on bishop d6, we do the same thing. a5, knight c3, knight a6, say rook d1, knight b4, and so on. Once again, we play for the b4 square. So this is how we play these positions with a4 played. Now, bishop g5 instead of bishop f4 is the main line. And believe it or not, we do the same thing. So a5, knight c3, knight a6, bishop f6, e4, knight b4. We aren't afraid of d5, of course, we have it defended. We aren't afraid of e5 because it gives away the d5 square. And the bishop is misplaced, it would have to be on e4 or on d3 to cause any sort of issues. So I try to approach this repertoire very, very simply, where I'm recommending stuff you can play as a setup. So even if your opponent deviates from theory, which on my level, probably your level, happens a lot, you still know what you're doing. Okay, now let's head into the exchange. So d4, d5, c4, e6, knight 3, knight f6, and they take, and they take. So, as you probably know, this is what I play with white when I play the Queen's Gambit. I like this variation a lot. Bishop g5, always played, c6. Now, white can play queen c2 or e3. It doesn't really matter. I think e3 is slightly more common. Bishop e7. Once again, queen c2 is possible, bishop d3 is possible. Personally, I usually play queen c2, but bishop d3 is slightly more common. Knight bd7, and now white can choose a setup. Now, in order to simplify this, instead of looking at theory, we're going to look at three different plans. One plan, let's say, begins with queen c2, black castles, white plays knight g2, rook e8. One plan is f3 and e4 after castles kingside. One plan is castles queenside, and once again f3, e4. The main difference in white's setups is the knight. Whether the knight goes to f3 or to e2 is going to determine the nature of the position. When the knight goes to e2, it goes to e2 in order to prepare e4. That may sound strange, but it's not blocking the f-pawn. Also, in the event of e4, I may sneeze, excuse me, it's defending d4, which may not be important, but there it is. Oh, I really may sneeze. Now, the second type of setup is a setup with knight f3. A setup with knight f3 usually signifies that white's going for a minority attack with b4. In fact, if white doesn't go for b4, there's very little white can do. So one could argue that knight g2 is a more flexible move, after which a minority attack may still be playable, but it's more flexible also because it allows f3, e4, which knight f3 obviously doesn't allow. So let us have a look at this typical minority attack idea. So what we're going to do, our setup is very schematic. We play bishop e7, knight bd7, castles, then we go rook e8, whatever white does. Then we play knight f8, defending h7. And after that, well, white can do many things. Rook a b1, preparing a minority attack. They could go h3, they could go rook a e1. Let's say rook b1. Now this means that b4 is coming. If we don't play a5 or react immediately, black is going to take, we take back, they play b4. They have distracted the bishop from b4. So what I recommend we do here is a5. Now, white can keep preparing the minority attack. a3. Now there really isn't much we can do now. b4 is coming, you know, they're going to take on f6 and play b4. So we have to fight dynamically. And a very common theme in the Carlsbad structure is this loose bishop, which is attacked twice. We can use that tactically to play knight e4. And the game here is to distract white from playing b4, b5 until we've, you know, compensated somehow with control over the e file. So now the bishop's hanging, they take. We play queen e7, and now we are defending the e4 square enough times. If they play b4 now, well, they open up our rook. We could take on c3, for example. Of course, knight e4 loses a piece, so bishop e4. d4, knight d2. We have to defend. The pawn is attacked, so f5. And now they play b4. And what did we get? Well, we have f4 to look forward to, perhaps, in the future. We can take on b4, and after a b4, our rook is active down the a file, and after something like bishop e6, it's not really clear what black should do. If they play b5, well, there's no longer a pawn on d5, so it's not such a big deal to have a backward c pawn. This game has been reached once between two, let's say, FIDE master level players. In this position, you could play something like g6, but you could also just go c5. And on d5, bishop f7, if we manage to play b6, this pawn is secure, and this pawn looks like it's going to fall. Perhaps knight d7, knight f6, rook d8, and there really is no trouble. So that's one way to play this position. You cannot prevent b5. And when it happens, you need to be ready with some sort of counterplay. Just waiting passively would lead to complete disaster. Now, instead of rook a b1, a more common way to play is h3. And against h3, which isn't as quick as rook a b1, I recommend a different setup. We're going to play g6. And the reason we play g6 is because we want control over f5. It also doesn't hurt to control h7, to defend h7, because we want to go knight e6, knight g7, knight f5 eventually. And if we went knight e6 straight away, black would just take on f6, bishop f6, and bishop takes h7. So g6 is a multi-purpose move. When they play rook a b1, we now go knight e6, the bishop's attacked, so, you know, bishop h4, knight g7, they play b4, we just allow it, we don't care. At this point, we play a6 because let's at least make them play a4 and open up our rook on an open file. So a4, and now bishop f5. And once again, we're fighting for the e4 square, we're fighting for the f5 square, and we're compensating for a successful minority attack. So b5, ab, ab, we take on d3, queen takes, and we play knight f5. And now the bishop is out of squares. If bishop g5, we can just go h6. So the bishop must take. And they play bc, bc. Now you could say, well, this is the nightmare scenario you showed us with a successful minority attack. Yes, that's true. But it isn't such a big deal to have this weakness when you have such good control over the e4 square. And of course, our knight may come to c4, e4, or b5. So for example, well, knight a4 isn't playable. So let's say queen c2 preparing knight a4. Knight d6. If they play knight a4 now, we can play knight c4. Okay, queen c6 hangs. Excuse me, I have to defend my pawn first. So let's say rook e6. If queen c6 now, we can now go knight c4, and this looks like trouble. Let's say queen b5, knight a3, we're winning already. So this isn't theory, of course, this is just me trying to play with myself, trying to play the game with myself. But as you can see, you have to compensate for a successful minority attack, and this is an absolute perfect game by white. Theory, best moves, and even though the minority attack was successful by getting the knight to f5 and then eventually d6 and c4. Sorry, I played knight b5. I should have gone knight c4, guarding c6. What am I saying? So this is the exchange. Now, when they play knight g2, we do the same thing, but we know that f3 is coming, f3 and e4. So we go rook e8, they castle. We go knight f8, they go f3. Now what I like to do against this is bishop e6. And after rook, well, there are many moves here. Let's say rook a, e1. I like to move rook c8. And if they go e4 straight away, which is playable, takes fe4 and c5. This is the point. If they go d5, they are almost completely losing after c4. Because the bishop is hanging, and if you take my bishop, I play knight e6 and your bishop is still hanging. So bishop c4, I play knight g5, and that's the end of the game. So d5 doesn't work. So against c5, they have to do something else. They have to take on f6, I think, and play e5. And after, well, bishop e7 is passive, so let's say bishop h4, for example. We now have the bishop pair. This is a typical weakness you get in the advanced Caro-Kann, for example, except that we have a bishop on e6 instead of a pawn. And I think this is a very favorable structure for black. The engine also says black slightly better. Now, let's move on to main line stuff, one could say. So d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7. Okay, black has two moves here, bishop g5 and bishop f4. Of course, g3 is still possible, cd is still possible, queen c2 as a sort of waiting move is still possible. Against queen c2, I like just castling. I mean, it doesn't change things too much. So okay. Now we're looking at the Horwitz, excuse me, attack. And the idea behind this move is to sometimes put pressure on c7 if you're not careful, but not really. The idea is to keep things flexible without allowing knight e4 and exchanges on g5 most often. And once again, white wants to play e3 after the bishop has left the structure. So we castle, they go e3, and since, as you're going to see in the next chapter in the Tartakower, if the bishop was on g5, we would go h6, but since it isn't, there's no need to go h6, so we just go b6. We play the same setup, whatever white does in this main line, whether white goes bishop f4 or bishop g5. Now white has a couple of moves, but most commonly they're going to take on d5, and that's the critical line by far. The alternatives are bishop e2, bishop d3, or the flexible rook c1, which are eventually going to transpose with the difference of the bishop being on d3 or e2. One thing I want to show you before going into the main line is if the bishop goes to d3, then I like taking, they take, and bishop a6. I think this is a very simple way to get rid of your weak bishop on c8 without, having to do anything fancy. So bishop d3 is the only exception. If they go bishop e2, we just continue with bishop b7 and c5, structure type A that we've seen at the beginning of the video. Now, problems could begin when they play the best move, CD. Now, as we said, the idea behind CD is if we take ED, then B6 is a wasted move. Also, if we took ED and then went bishop A6, then the bishop can exchange in one move, so it doesn't work. That's why we play knight D5. And of course, white should take, because the bishop's hanging. And now, guess what we recapture with? We recapture with the queen, because once again, we don't want our bishop blocked. And let's say bishop D3, which is a good move. Now you could go bishop A6. You can also go bishop B7. Both are fine. However, on bishop B7, you lose the C7 pawn. So I'm not a big fan of that. But I think the best move... Oh, let me just delete that. The best move is C5. Even though it's not the best engine choice, C5 just defends C7 and starts opening up the queen side and liquidating the center, and we can then safely play bishop b7 on the next move without losing material. Okay, so that's the Horwitz. Now the main line. So once again, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight 3, knight 6, knight 3, bishop e7, bishop g5, h6. In the next chapter, we're going to have a look at bishop takes f6, which I think isn't as challenging. Now we're going into the Tartakower. Castles, e3, b6. This is the beginning of the Tartakower defense, which you could argue is the main line of the Queen's Gambit declined. Once again, the idea is to develop the bishop. Now, since the bishop is over here, we're going to treat this position slightly differently. Once again, white has a million different moves. I'm going to show you the main line and try to explain some ideas from the alternative lines. If they play CD, we take with the knight. We know that much. If they play bishop d3, we don't take. We don't take the same way we did in the previous position with the bishop on f4, because now the bishop has an easier time reaching safety of g3. That's my interpretation. Now, instead, we go bishop b7. And when they castle, we go knight bd7. They do something, queen e2, and we play c5. So we stick to our normal structure. So those are the two exceptions I wanted to mention, but the main move is bishop e2, and it's very similar to bishop d3, especially if you take on c4. We do the same thing, bishop b7. Now here, white usually takes on f6. If white just castles, we go knight bd7, they do something, we play c5. They usually take on f6, and the reason they take on f6 is so that on bishop f6 they can play cd. And in my opinion, this is the biggest problem of the entire repertoire. We don't have a way to avoid this. There's nothing we can do. We don't want to give away our bishop. That would be a disaster. Of course, we don't take back with the queen, so we're forced to play ed5. Do not despair. Now, we know the downside of allowing the b pawn free movement, so, white, of course, plays b4. This prevents c5. We want to desperately play c5. So what we're going to do here is we're going to play c6 to prevent b5. It's very important. White castles, and then we play a5. Now, if white plays a3, that's perfectly fine. We can still go b5 and try to keep things closed, reroute the bishop to this diagonal. This is slightly awkward, one could say, but, knight d7, we can also play a b4. So if they play a3, I like b5, just shutting things down. On a5, the main move, though, is b5. And by playing b5, we have weakened the c5 square. And this is the main position of the Tartakower. You could argue that on a high level, this is where the play actually begins, c5. And dc5 is playable, but knight e5 is more common. When knight e5 is played, we go cd4, ed4, bishop e5, d5, and d4. And I think this is the best we can get. It's not perfect, because the knight's coming to a4 and b6 is going to be weak, but you know, we have to live with it. There's nothing else we can do. The upside is we can play knight c5, knight d7, rook c8, knight c5, and challenge that knight. If we manage to do that, then we're equal. The engine says equal anyway, but I'm just trying to explain things from a human perspective. Finally, same position as the Tartakower, but they take on f6. They take on f6, we take back, they go e3. Now we have the same type of position, but we can approach it differently. We castle, rook c1. Notice that we haven't played b6 yet. We can now play c6 and switch to a plan from the Moscow variation of the Semislav. And this is actually the main line here. But in order to liberate this bishop, you could of course go b6, bishop b7, and c5, but you can also play e5. And since the bishop is on f6, in the Moscow variation of the Semislav, the queen recaptures on f6. That's a huge difference, because the bishop's still on f8. Since the bishop is on f6, e5 is an easy move to make. So white goes bishop d3. Of course, c6 just supports the center. If white ever takes on d5, we play e d5, the bishop is free, we're up the bishop pair, great position. Knight d7, preparing e5, castles. And now, if we played e5 straight away, there would be two issues. The first issue is we get an IQP position after cd. The second issue, we give away the b5 square. So what we want to do before e5 is exchange on c4. And this is very common in many Semislav positions. Takes, bishop takes, now we play e5. We play e5 because white doesn't have cd anymore, isolating our pawn. And this is where, you know, the theory begins. White can play h3, white can play knight e4, white can play bishop b3, white has a million moves that are all in the repertoire. The main move is h3. And against this we go e d4, they go e d4, and we go knight b6. And I think this is my type of position. Bishop pair playing against an IQP. Of course d5 could happen. I mean, the position is just equal and white has knight e5. But this is what I like to get, which is why against bishop takes f6, we don't play for b6, we play for c6. Okay, the repertoire is available below. Let me know what you think. I did my best to simplify things. I didn't want to overwhelm you with theory. I wanted to make it easy to understand and follow. Yeah, I hope you find it useful. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.